The rain in Los Angeles always felt like an anomaly, a glitch in the perfectly curated simulation of endless sunshine and palm trees. And tonight it fell with a punishing weight, hammering against the tinted windows of the limousine, as if trying to scrub the city clean of its sins. Jonathan Miller sat in the back of the Lincoln Town car, the leather cool and unyielding against his tuxedo, his fingers idly tracing the contours of the golden statuette that rested on the seat beside him. It was the Director of the Year award, a heavy, lifeless piece of metal that the world coveted, yet in the dimly lit interior of the car, it looked less like a triumph and more like a paperweight. He loosened his bow tie, the silk fabric feeling like a noose he had been wearing for the last 5 hours, and exhaled a plume of weary breath against the glass, watching the condensation obscure the blurring lights of Sunset Boulevard. Usually, this was the moment of victory he lived for, the crescendo of validation after months of grueling production schedules and sleepless nights in the editing bay. But tonight, the silence in the car was deafening because it was singular. Grace should have been here. That was the thought that kept snagging in his mind like a splinter. Grace, with her quiet smiles and the way she would squeeze his hand when the anxiety of the nominations became too suffocating, had stayed home, citing a migraine. It was unlike her to miss a ceremony, unlike her to leave him to navigate the sharks and the sycophants alone. But Jonathan had dismissed it with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world revolved around his schedule. He had assumed she would be waiting up for him, perhaps with a bottle of that cheap red wine she loved, but he tolerated, ready to listen to his monologue about the incompetence of the lighting crew or the stupidity of the critics. The car ascended the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills, the engine humming a low, expensive purr, until it pulled up to the driveway of their glass and steel fortress. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the sprawling city grid below, a house that Jonathan had bought to prove he had made it. But tonight, staring up at it through the deluge, it looked like a mausoleum. It was completely dark. There was no warm amber glow from the living room, no silhouette pacing by the window. A sudden, irrational spike of dread pierced through the alcohol buzzing in his bloodstream. Jonathan stepped out into the rain, ignoring the driver who scrambled to open an umbrella, and strode toward the massive oak front door. He keyed in the code, the beep echoing sharply in the night air, and pushed the door open. The air inside was conditioned to a sterile chill, smelling of lemon polish and stale silence. "Grace," he called out, his voice bouncing off the marble floors and disappearing into the vaulted ceiling. There was no answer, only the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the skylight, a sound that suddenly felt oppressive, like dirt being shoveled onto a coffin. He walked into the living room, dropping his coat on the pristine white sofa, his eyes scanning the space for a sign of life. The kitchen was spotless, too spotless. The coffee maker was cold. There were no dishes in the sink. It was as if the house had been staged for a showing, stripped of the messy, chaotic evidence of human habitation. He moved toward the bedroom, his footsteps heavy, the golden statue still clutched in his left hand like a weapon. The door to the master suite was ajar. Inside, the bed was made with military precision, the duvet smooth and undisturbed. He walked to the walk-in closet, a cavernous space usually overflowing with her chaotic collection of vintage scarves and cardigans, and froze. It was half empty. The side where his bespoke suits hung remained untouched, an arrogant phalanx of fabric, but Grace's side was decimated. The shelves where her shoes usually sat were bare. The drawers were pulled open, revealing nothing but empty space. She hadn't taken everything. The diamond necklace he had bought her for their 5th anniversary was still sitting on the velvet island in the center of the room, coiled like a glittering snake. She had left the expensive designer handbags he insisted she wear to premieres. She had taken only the things that were hers, the worn denim, the comfortable sweaters, the battered leather satchel she used for her writing. It was a surgical extraction, precise and premeditated. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face, a cold numbness spreading from his chest to his fingertips. He turned back to the bedroom and saw it then, sitting on the nightstand under the glow of the street lamps filtering through the window. A single white envelope. Next to it lay a thick stack of legal documents. He approached the nightstand as if walking toward a ledge. He dropped the award onto the bed, where it sank into the memory foam without a sound, and picked up the envelope. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper, her handwriting familiar yet strangely jagged, as if written in a hurry or with a trembling hand. "I used to think I was the ink in your pen," the note read, devoid of a greeting. "But I realized I was just the paper you crumpled up when the draft didn't suit you. I can't be invisible anymore, Jonathan. I'm tired of being the ghost in your machine. Don't look for me." He stared at the words, the sentences refusing to compute. Invisible? She was the wife of Jonathan Miller. She was the envy of every woman at the country club. How could she feel invisible? He reached for the legal documents. Divorce papers. Signed. Dated 3 days ago. And clipped to the front page was a business card, a glossy black rectangle with silver embossing that Jonathan recognized instantly. It was a card he had seen 1,000 times, belonging to a man he had trusted with his life, his finances, and his career. Aaron Hughes, executive producer. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Aaron, his mentor? The man who had financed his first indie film when no one else would look at him? The man who had slapped him on the back just last week and told him he was proud of him? It made no sense. Grace and Aaron despised each other. Grace found Aaron slimy and manipulative. She had warned Jonathan about him for years. Why would she run to him? His phone buzzed in his pocket, a violent vibration against his thigh. Then it buzzed again, and again. A cacophony of notifications erupted, shattering the silence. Jonathan pulled the device out with trembling fingers. The screen was lit up with alerts from Twitter, TMZ, and Variety. The headline on the first notification stopped his heart. Scandal in Hollywood. Director Jonathan Miller's wife spotted boarding private jet with producer Aaron Hughes. Sources allege long-term affair. Attached was a grainy paparazzi photo taken at a private airfield. It showed Grace, her face pale and unsmiling, stepping up the stairs of a jet, and behind her, with a hand possessively on the small of her back, was Aaron Hughes. The image was a punch to the gut, visceral and nauseating. The timeline, the photo, the divorce papers, it was a coordinated strike. While he was walking the red carpet, smiling for the cameras, basking in the adoration of strangers, his entire life was being dismantled behind his back by the two people closest to him. A primal roar of rage built up in his throat, but it came out as a strangled gasp. He threw the phone across the room, watching it smash against the wall, shattering into a spiderweb of glass and metal. The illusion of control he had cultivated for a decade, the carefully constructed persona of the genius auteur who saw everything and missed nothing, disintegrated in an instant. He wasn't the director of this scene. He was just a character, a fool standing in an empty room while the credits rolled on his marriage. Jonathan sank onto the edge of the bed, the silence of the house now screaming at him, realizing that the rain outside was nothing compared to the storm that had just made landfall inside his life. The morning sun over Los Angeles did not rise gently. It assaulted the bedroom through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, a blinding, relentless white glare that exposed every dust mote and every fracture in Jonathan Miller's shattered reality. He woke up on the floor, his cheek pressed against the cold hardwood, a half-empty bottle of single-malt scotch acting as a sentinel beside his head. For a brief, merciful second, his mind was a blank slate, a screen waiting for a projection, before the events of the previous night came rushing back like a tidal wave of bile. The empty closet, the divorce papers, the photograph of Grace boarding that jet with Aaron Hughes. It was not a nightmare. It was a scene he could not cut, a take he could not order to be res hot. He pulled himself up, his head throbbing with a rhythm that matched the dull ache in his chest. The house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Before, the silence of the house had been a canvas for his genius, a space where he could think and create while Grace moved softly in the periphery, ensuring his coffee was hot and his schedule was managed. Now, the silence was an accusation. He walked to the window and looked out at the swimming pool, its surface perfectly still, mirroring the emptiness of the sky. He found himself drifting into a memory, a flashback that felt deceptively warm but now tasted like ash. It was 2 years ago, at the premiere of his psychological thriller The Echo. They were standing on the balcony of the Chateau Marmont. He remembered holding a glass of champagne, pontificating to a circle of adoring critics about the visual language of isolation in his film. Grace had been standing right beside him, wearing a silver dress that made her look ethereal. He remembered glancing at her and thinking how lucky she was to share in this life, this pinnacle of artistic success. He had squeezed her shoulder and said to the group, "And of course, my muse, who keeps me grounded." The critics had laughed politely. Grace had smiled, but looking back at that memory now, stripping away the filter of his own narcissism, he saw something else. He saw the way her smile did not reach her eyes. He saw the way she shifted her weight, as if she were exhausted, not by the heels, but by the weight of being a prop in his one-man show. He had mistaken her silence for awe, when in reality, it might have been the silence of a woman screaming inside a soundproof room. "You were never happy," Jonathan whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. "You were acting." The denial surged up then, a defensive wall built to protect his bruising ego. No, that was impossible. Grace loved him. Grace was him. They were a singular entity. This had to be Aaron's doing. Aaron Hughes, the man with the silver tongue and the heart of a shark. Aaron must have manipulated her, coerced her, or perhaps Grace was having some sort of breakdown. The narrative that his wife, his quiet, loyal Grace, would willingly run off with his boss to humiliate him was a plot hole he refused to accept. It did not fit the character profile he had written for her in his mind. Fueled by a sudden, jagged burst of adrenaline, Jonathan showered and dressed. He put on his signature black suit, though it hung a little looser on his frame today, and drove his Porsche toward Eclipse Studios. He needed to confront Aaron. He needed to look the man in the eye and demand the truth. The drive to the studio lot was usually a procession of triumph. He would wave to the guards, drive straight to his reserved spot right next to the executive building, and walk into the offices like a god returning to his temple. However, today was different. As he approached the heavy iron gates of Eclipse Studios, the security barrier did not lift. The guard, a man named Stan whom Jonathan had driven past for 10 years without ever really looking at, stepped out of the booth. Stan did not smile. He did not wave. He held up a hand, palm out, a universal gesture of denial that felt like a slap in the face. "Open the gate, Stan," Jonathan said, leaning out of the window, forcing a tone of authority he did not feel. "I cannot do that, Mr. Miller," Stan replied, his voice flat, devoid of the usual deference. "My orders are clear. You are not permitted on the lot." "Not permitted?" Jonathan laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. "I built this studio, Stan. My movies paid for that booth you were standing in. Call Aaron. Tell him I am here." "Mr. Hughes is aware," Stan said, shifting his weight uncomfortably but not moving an inch. "Legal has issued a directive. Your pass has been deactivated. Any attempt to enter will be treated as trespassing. Please turn around, sir." Trespassing. The word hung in the humid air between them. He was Jonathan Miller, the auteur, the visionary, and he was being treated like a disgruntled extra. He looked past Stan, toward the executive building in the distance, the glass tower where Aaron sat. He imagined Aaron up there, watching through the tinted windows, perhaps sipping espresso, laughing at the little director in his sports car who thought he held the power. The humiliation was total. It burned hotter than the anger. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, the leather creaking under the pressure. He wanted to ram the gate. He wanted to scream. But the paparazzi vans were already starting to circle like vultures sensing a carcass. He saw a camera lens point at him from a nearby bush. He would not give them the shot of his breakdown. Not yet. He reversed the car with a screech of tires and sped away, fleeing the kingdom that had locked him out. He drove aimlessly for hours, the pristine landscape of Los Angeles blurring into a meaningless streak of color. He eventually found himself back at his house, the fortress of solitude. He went straight to the bar. The bottle of scotch from the morning was finished, so he opened another. As the alcohol began to numb the sharp edges of his reality, he wandered into his home office. The walls were lined with posters of his films, monuments to his ego. He sat at his mahogany desk and opened his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wanted to write. Writing had always been his therapy, his way of controlling the chaos of the world. He wanted to write a scene where the hero kicks down the door and reclaims his wife. But when he looked at the blinking cursor, nothing came. The screen remained white, mocking him. He realized then, with a sinking horror that felt like drowning, that he had not written a single line of dialogue in 5 years without running it past Grace first. She was the one who fixed the pacing. She was the one who added the emotional depth. "This character feels flat, John," she would say, and then she would rewrite the scene, and he would take the credit. He had called her his muse, but was she actually his engine? Without her, the machine was broken. He opened a drawer to find a pen, needing to physically scratch something out, anything to prove he still existed as a creator. Under a pile of contracts, his hand brushed against something cold and hard. He pushed the papers aside. It was a framed photograph of their wedding day. Grace was laughing, her head thrown back, looking radiant and alive, a look he hadn't seen on her face in years. Beside her, Aaron Hughes stood with his arm around Jonathan's shoulder, smiling that predatory, tight-lipped smile. The composition of the photo was perfect, the foreshadowing undeniable. The villain had been in the frame the entire time. Jonathan stared at the image, his vision blurring with tears and rage. He picked up the heavy crystal decanter of whiskey and, with a guttural roar that tore through his throat, smashed it down onto the photograph. The glass shattered, the amber liquid soaking into the wedding dress, turning the memory into a soggy, distorted mess. The facade was gone. There was no more glass to hide behind. He was alone, he was blocked, and for the first time in his life, he was utterly powerless. 3 months had passed, but time in Los Angeles did not heal wounds. It merely bleached them white under the relentless sun, leaving behind scars that were tough, ugly, and sensitive to the touch. The Santa Ana winds had arrived, the devil winds that blew hot and dry from the desert, charging the air with static electricity and a tension that made the skin itch. For Jonathan Miller, the atmosphere was suffocating. He sat at the head of the conference table in the gleaming production office of a smaller, independent studio, the only place that would take a meeting with him after the Eclipse scandal, staring at a script that felt less like a screenplay and more like an autopsy report of his own talent. They were in the middle of a table read for a project he had hastily assembled, a neo-noir thriller that he had convinced himself was a return to his gritty roots. But as the actors read the lines aloud, the words hung in the air, heavy and lifeless. The dialogue, which had looked passable on his laptop screen at 3 a.m. through a haze of whiskey, sounded wooden and contrived when spoken by human beings. It lacked the rhythm, the subtext, the delicate dance between what is said and what is meant, the very things Grace used to inject into his drafts during her polishing sessions. He remembered how she would sit cross-legged on the floor, glasses perched on the end of her nose, slashing through his pretentious monologues with a red pen. "People don't give speeches in the kitchen, Jonathan," she would say softly. "They fight about the milk when they are actually angry about the marriage." "Excuse me, Mr. Miller?" The voice belonged to the lead actress, a young, ambitious starlet named Chloe who had grown up watching his films. She looked hesitant, her brow furrowed as she hovered over page 42. "I'm having trouble with this scene. My character says she hates him, but then she kisses him immediately. It feels unearned. I'm not sure where the emotional shift happens." Jonathan rubbed his temples, feeling a headache blooming behind his eyes. In the past, he would have turned to Grace, who always sat in the corner during readings, and she would have offered a brilliant, concise psychological insight that unlocked the scene for the actor. Then, Jonathan would have nodded sagely and taken the credit. Now, the corner was empty. There was only a potted ficus plant where his wife used to be. "It's a moment of passion, Chloe," Jonathan snapped, his voice louder than he intended, causing the room to flinch. "It's visceral. Don't overthink it. Just say the lines." But it doesn't make sense, the lead actor chimed in, leaning back in his chair with a look of bored skepticism. The motivation isn't on the page, John. It feels like we are just moving from plot point A to plot point B without any engine. The criticism hit him like a physical blow. It was the exact phrase Grace had used to describe bad writing. An engine without fuel. Jonathan stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. The motivation is that I am the director, and I say it works. We are trying to make art here, not a soap opera. If you can't find the emotion, that is a failure of your acting, not my writing. The room went deathly silent. It was the kind of silence that signals the end of something. The producer, a man named Marcus who had been nervously checking his watch for the last hour, slowly closed his folder. He didn't look angry. He looked pitying, which was infinitely worse. Jonathan, can we have a word outside? Marcus asked, his tone gentle, the way one speaks to a child or a volatile patient. 10 minutes later, Jonathan was standing in the blinding parking lot, the hot wind whipping his tie around his neck. He had been fired. Not just fired, but let go from a project he had written, on a budget that was a fraction of what he used to command. Marcus had been polite, but firm. The studio feels the material isn't there, John. And frankly, the vibe, it's toxic. You're not yourself. He walked to his car, feeling like a ghost wandering through a world that no longer believed in him. He wasn't Jonathan Miller, the visionary. He was a fraud who had been exposed the moment his ghostwriter left the building. The realization was a cold, sharp knife twisting in his gut. He hadn't just lost his wife, he had lost his brain. All those awards, the accolades, the reviews praising his deep understanding of the human condition, they belonged to Grace. He was just the technician who set up the camera. She was the one who provided the soul. He drove home, stopping only at a liquor store on the corner of his street. As he placed a bottle of vodka on the counter, Scotch felt too refined for the mood he was in. His eyes drifted to the magazine rack next to the register. There, staring back at him from the cover of Vanity Fair, was Grace. She looked different. The messy bun and oversized sweaters were gone. She was wearing a structured crimson suit, her hair sleek and sharp, her makeup impeccable. She was standing next to Aaron Hughes, whose hand rested possessively on her shoulder. The headline screamed in bold, yellow letters. The Golden Touch. How Aaron Hughes and his new head of development, Grace Turner, are reshaping Hollywood. Jonathan's hands shook as he picked up the magazine. He flipped to the article. It described Grace as a hidden gem, finally stepping into the light, the creative force behind Aaron's new slate of blockbuster projects. There were quotes from Aaron praising her genius, her insight, her brilliance. It was a public coronation. They were parading her talent, the talent that Jonathan had monopolized and hidden for a decade, and monetizing it for the world to see. He threw the magazine onto the conveyor belt, paid for the vodka, and fled. Back in his house, the darkness was absolute. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by the shadows of furniture he no longer recognized. He opened the magazine again, reading the article by the light of his phone. Every word was a testament to his own failure. Grace wasn't just surviving without him. She was thriving. She had ascended. He poured the vodka into a coffee mug and drank it straight, the burn providing a momentary distraction from the hollow ache in his chest. He looked around the vast, empty room. The silence was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket. He realized he had two choices. He could finish the bottle, fade into obscurity, and become the tragic anecdote people whispered about at parties, the director who lost his mind. Or he could find a way to scream back at the silence. But he had no words. The ink in his pen had run dry the day she left. He was a director without a script, a general without an army. And as the alcohol pulled him down into a dreamless, black sleep, the image of Grace in that red suit burned behind his eyelids, not as his wife, but as a stranger who had stolen his soul and sold it to his enemy. He was at rock bottom, and the floor was made of glass, and he could see the abyss stretching out endlessly beneath him. The bottle of vodka was empty, but the rage inside Jonathan Miller was far from satiated. It had only just begun to metabolize the alcohol into a volatile fuel that demanded destruction. The home office, once a sanctuary of leather-bound scripts and muted lighting, now felt like a cage where the walls were closing in, plastered with the mocking faces of his past successes. He stood in the center of the room, swaying slightly, the room spinning around him in a sickening waltz. He looked at the framed poster of The Silent Echo, the film that had launched his career, and suddenly, the sight of his own name in bold typeface was unbearable. It was a lie, a brand built on stolen genius. With a guttural roar that tore at his vocal cords, Jonathan lunged forward and swept his arm across the mahogany desk. The lamp, the expensive Mont Blanc pens, the stack of unread industry magazines, they all crashed to the floor in a cacophony of shattering glass and splintering plastic. But it was not enough. The noise was too brief, the destruction too superficial. He picked up a heavy bronze bust of Orson Welles and hurled it at the wall, smashing the glass of a framed award. He overturned the chairs. He ripped the curtains from their rods, exposing the black, indifferent night outside. He was tearing down the set of his life, desperate to find something real beneath the props. In his frenzy, he turned his attention to an old, antique writing bureau that sat in the corner. It was a delicate piece of furniture, French provincial, that Grace had bought at a flea market years ago. She used to sit there while he worked at the main desk, scribbling in her notebooks, her presence a quiet, steady hum in the background of his chaotic genius. He hated it. He hated it because it smelled like her vanilla perfume. He grabbed the bureau by its legs and heaved, flipping it over. It crashed onto the hardwood floor with a sickening crack, the wood splitting, the drawers spilling their contents of paper clips and dried out pens across the room. Jonathan stood over the wreckage, panting heavily, sweat stinging his eyes. He expected to feel relief, a release of pressure, but he only felt a deeper, colder emptiness. He turned to walk away, to find another bottle, when something caught his eye. The impact of the crash had dislodged a panel on the underside of the bureau. It was a false bottom, a hidden compartment concealed with the kind of craftsmanship that went unnoticed unless the object was destroyed. In the debris of the splintered wood, a flat, metal lockbox had slid out. It was dark gray, unassuming, taped shut with heavy duct tape. Jonathan frowned, his drunken haze momentarily clearing, replaced by a sharp, vibrating curiosity. He fell to his knees amidst the ruin of his office, ignoring the shards of glass that bit into his trousers. He reached out and picked up the box. It was heavy. He peeled back the tape, his fingers trembling not from alcohol now, but from a sudden, instinctive dread. He pried the lid open. Inside, there were no love letters. There were no Polaroids of illicit trysts with Erin. There was no jewelry. Instead, there was a stack of financial ledgers, bound with rubber bands, and a small, leather-bound diary. Jonathan picked up the ledgers first. He was not an accountant. He had always prided himself on being an artist who left the boring money stuff to Erin and his team, but he knew enough to recognize a crime when he saw it. The pages were photocopies of internal documents from Eclipse Studios. As he flipped through them, his blood ran cold. He saw his own production company, Miller Arts, listed as the recipient of millions of dollars from offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Panama. The money was then funneled out into shell companies owned by Erin Hughes, disguised as production costs, consulting fees, and location scouting expenses for movies that were never made. He saw his own signature at the bottom of these documents. A wave of nausea washed over him. He remembered those days. Erin would come into his trailer on set, laughing, holding a stack of papers. Just standard insurance forms. John, sign here so we can keep the cameras rolling. And Jonathan, arrogant, busy, trusting, had signed them without reading a single word. He had not just been a puppet, he had been the bagman. Erin had built a massive money laundering operation and placed it squarely on Jonathan's shoulders. If the FBI ever looked closely, Jonathan Miller would go to prison for 20 years for fraud and embezzlement, while Erin Hughes would walk away clean. His hands shaking violently, Jonathan dropped the ledgers and picked up the diary. It was Grace's. He recognized the notebook, She carried it everywhere, telling him she used it for grocery lists and random thoughts. He opened it to the last entry, dated the day before she disappeared. The handwriting was pressed hard into the paper, the ink dark and frantic. October 14th. He showed me everything today. Aaron. He sat me down in his office and laid out the files. He told me the investigation is starting next week. The IRS, the feds, they are coming for the studio. And he has set it up so beautifully, so cruelly. All the roads lead to Jonathan. John signed everything. John is the face of the company. John is the one who will fall. Aaron gave me a choice. A trade. If I stay, Jonathan goes to prison. He will be destroyed. He will die in a cell, wondering what went wrong. But if I go with Aaron, if I become his, if I write for him, if I let the world believe I am the whore who left her husband for the rich boss, then he makes the evidence disappear. He shreds the files. He restructures the debt. Jonathan walks free. He keeps his career. He keeps his life. I looked at Aaron's face and I saw the devil. But then I thought of Jonathan. My brilliant, arrogant, helpless Jonathan. He wouldn't survive a day in prison. He barely survives a day without coffee. I have to do this. I have to break his heart to save his life. He must hate me. He must believe I am a monster. If he tries to find me, if he tries to fight Aaron, he will trigger the trap. I have to be the villain in his story so he can keep being the hero in his own. Goodbye, my love. I am leaving to keep you clean. Jonathan stared at the page until the words blurred into meaningless black shapes. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was screaming. The air was sucked out of his lungs. He felt a physical sensation of his heart breaking, not in the poetic sense, but a literal, agonizing constriction in his chest. She hadn't left him. She had sold herself to save him. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Every drink he had taken, every curse he had screamed at her name, every moment of self-pity he had wallowed in for the last 3 months, it all turned to ash in his mouth. He had been mourning a betrayal that never happened, while she was living a nightmare to protect him. She was a prisoner in a golden cage, writing scripts for a monster, bearing the weight of the world's judgment, all to keep him from wearing an orange jumpsuit. Jonathan closed the diary. He slowly stood up. The dizziness was gone. The drunkenness had evaporated, burned away by a cold, white-hot clarity. He looked around the destroyed office, at the debris of his tantrum, and felt a profound shame. But beneath the shame, something else was kindling. It was a feeling he hadn't felt since his very first film, a dangerous, focused intensity. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights of Los Angeles. They didn't look like stars anymore. They looked like targets. Grace had written a script where she was the villain and he was the victim. It was a noble script, a tragic script. But Jonathan Miller was a director. And he decided, right then and there, that he was going to change the ending. He wasn't going to just get her back. He was going to burn Aaron's world to the ground. And he was going to use the very art that Aaron had exploited to do it. He turned back to the safe, gathered the ledgers, and placed them carefully on the only table he hadn't overturned. He wasn't a drunk ex-husband anymore. He was a man with a plan, and for the first time in years, the machine had a ghost, and the ghost was angry. The coffee on the marble balustrade had lost its steam hours ago, settling into a stagnant, tepid pool of black liquid that mirrored the dark ocean churning below the cliffside estate. Grace Turner sat on the terrace of Aaron Hughes's Malibu fortress, wrapped in a cashmere shawl that cost more than her father's car, shivering not from the cold, but from a bone-deep chill that the California sun could never touch. From where she sat, she had a panoramic view of the Pacific, a vast expanse of blue that usually signaled freedom. But here, through the perimeter of tempered glass and security cameras, it looked like the walls of an aquarium. She was the prize fish, swimming in circles, kept alive and fed solely for the amusement of the owner. She turned her gaze back to the laptop screen resting on her knees. The cursor blinked with an impatient, rhythmic pulse, demanding words. She was writing the third act of a screenplay titled The Golden Hour, a project Aaron was already pre-selling to distributors as his next masterpiece. The industry whispered that Aaron Hughes had found a new, mysterious creative gear, that his notes had become sharper, his structures more profound. They did not know that the gear was a woman held hostage by blackmail, a woman pouring her own grief and suffocation into the dialogue of fictional characters. Every line she typed was a piece of her soul chipped away, a ransom payment made in intellectual property to keep the man she loved out of a federal prison cell. The sliding glass door behind her hissed open. Grace did not flinch. She had learned to suppress her startle reflex, to become as still and unreadable as a statue. She felt the heavy, suffocating presence of Aaron before she heard his footsteps. He moved with the arrogance of a man who owned the ground he walked on. His hand, heavy and smelling faintly of expensive cologne and cigars, landed on her shoulder, his fingers digging into the muscle just enough to be possessive, not enough to leave a bruise. "You are falling behind, darling," Aaron said, his voice smooth, like oil slicking over rough water. He leaned down, placing a kiss on the top of her head that made her skin crawl. "The studio is expecting the draft by Monday. We cannot have you gazing at the horizon like a tragic heroine. Productivity, Grace. That is the agreement." Grace kept her eyes on the screen, her fingers hovering over the keys. "I am thinking, Aaron. The protagonist, he needs a reason to forgive the betrayal. It does not feel earned yet." Aaron laughed, a low rumble that vibrated against her back. "Forgiveness is a weakness, Grace. Rewrite it. Make him take revenge. That is what audiences want. They want to see the weak man crushed and the strong man take what is his." He squeezed her shoulder harder. "Besides, we both know Jonathan never understood the concept of strength. He is probably still crying into a bottle of whiskey, wondering where his little muse went. Have you checked the tabloids today?" He looked quite pathetic at the liquor store. The mention of Jonathan's name was a calculated needle, designed to pierce her composure. Grace forced her breathing to remain shallow and even. She visualized a steel door in her mind, slamming it shut over the image of Jonathan's face. She could not afford to break. If she showed emotion, Aaron won. If she showed weakness, he would tighten the leash. "I do not care about Jonathan," Grace lied, her voice flat and monotone, devoid of any inflection. "I care about finishing this script so I can go to sleep." "That is my girl," Aaron murmured, satisfied by her coldness. He released her shoulder and walked to the edge of the balcony, looking out at his dominion. "You belong here, Grace. With the winners. You were drowning in his mediocrity. I gave you a platform. Never forget that I am the one who saved you." He left her then, the glass door sliding shut, sealing her back into her silence. Grace closed her eyes, and a single, hot tear escaped, tracking a burning line down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. She was not a wife here. She was an asset. She took a sip of the cold, bitter coffee, swallowing the distasteful liquid as a reminder of her reality. She had to stay cold. Coldness was armor. Coldness was survival. Across the sprawling city, miles away from the salt spray of Malibu, the atmosphere in Jonathan Miller's home was undergoing a drastic transformation. The chaotic debris of his breakdown had been cleared away. The shattered glass was swept up, the overturned furniture righted, and the heavy curtains thrown open to let the harsh, uncompromising daylight flood the room. Jonathan stood in the bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He looked like a castaway, hollow cheeks, bloodshot eyes, a beard that was more neglect than style. He picked up the razor. With steady, deliberate strokes, he began to shave. He scraped away the gray stubble, revealing the sharp jawline beneath. He was shearing off the victim. He was carving out the man who had found the ledgers in the safe. He walked back into his office, which now resembled a war room. The walls were covered in papers, photocopies of the financial records, timelines drawn in marker, and diagrams connecting Aaron Hughes to the shell companies. Jonathan had spent the last 48 hours sober, fueled only by adrenaline and a cold, focused rage. He had analyzed the trap Aaron had set. It was brilliant in its cruelty. If Jonathan went to the police with the ledgers, the paper trail was designed to implicate him. He had signed the documents. He was the CEO of the shell company. To the law, Jonathan was the embezzler, and Aaron was just the unaware investor. Grace had seen this. That was why she left. She knew the law could not save him. You thought you were directing a tragedy, Aaron. Jonathan whispered to the empty room, his voice raspy but steady. You thought I was just the actor who would read the lines you wrote for me. You forgot one thing. I am the one who cuts the film. He sat down at his desk, not the one he had overturned, but a small drafting table he had set up by the window. He placed a fresh stack of paper in front of him. He could not fight Aaron in a courtroom. He would lose. He could not fight him with fists. Aaron had security. He had to fight him on the only battleground where Jonathan Miller was the undisputed master, the narrative. He picked up his pen. He was not going to write a confession. He was not going to write a memoir. He was going to write a script. A script so compelling, so dangerously close to the truth, that it would act as a bait. Aaron Hughes was a narcissist. He could not resist a great story, especially one that mirrored his own perceived genius. Jonathan would write a fictional thriller about a producer who frames his director and steals his wife. He would weave the specific, incriminating details of the financial crimes into the plot, details that only the real perpetrator would recognize. He would create a Trojan horse made of paper and ink. Jonathan wrote the title page, The Producer's Game. Then, he turned the page and began to write scene 1. The words flowed out of him, not with the struggle of the last few months, but with a terrifying ease. He was channeling his pain, his love for Grace, and his hatred for Aaron into every dialogue, every scene description. He was no longer writing to win an award. He was writing to save a life. As night fell over Los Angeles, two writers sat in two different houses, separated by miles of concrete and a chasm of lies, yet connected by an invisible, unbreakable thread. Grace wrote to keep Jonathan safe. Jonathan wrote to set Grace free. They were typing in unison, a silent duet in the darkness, constructing the mechanism of their own salvation, one word at a time. The coffee on Jonathan's desk went cold, just as it had on Grace's, but neither of them noticed. The temperature in the room did not matter anymore. The fire was burning on the page. The press conference was staged in the library of the Four Seasons Hotel, a room that smelled of old money, leather-bound history, and the subtle, metallic tang of deceit. Jonathan Miller sat in a wingback chair, his posture intentionally slumped, his eyes shielded behind dark sunglasses even though the room was dimly lit. A dozen journalists from the most reputable industry publications sat before him, their recording devices blinking like hungry red eyes in the semi-darkness. They were expecting a breakdown. They were hungering for the final, incoherent ramblings of a man destroyed by scandal. Jonathan gave them exactly what they wanted, serving up his own humiliation on a silver platter. I have realized, Jonathan spoke, his voice low and raspy, rehearsed to perfection in front of his bathroom mirror, that the fire is gone. The industry, it requires a hunger that I no longer possess. I wish Grace and Aaron the best. Truly, they found something in each other that I could not provide. I am stepping away from directing to write a memoir. I need to process the past before I can even think about the future. The cameras flashed, capturing the image of the defeated genius, the cuckolded husband waving the white flag. It was a performance that would have won him an Oscar if the Academy gave awards for real-life lies. As he walked out of the hotel, ignoring the shouted questions about his mental health, a grim satisfaction settled in his gut. The first move on the chessboard had been made. He had made himself look harmless. He had made himself look finished. To a predator like Aaron Hughes, a wounded animal was not a threat. It was merely a meal that had already been digested. Aaron would see this interview and relax. He would toast to his victory with Grace, his guard lowering just enough for the knife to slip in. Later that evening, the atmosphere shifted from the performative sorrow of the press conference to the Shark Tank tension of a private booth at the San Vicente Bungalows. This was a club so exclusive that cameras were confiscated at the door, a sanctuary where the true power brokers of Hollywood cut the deals that shaped culture. Jonathan sat across from David Sterling, a man whose reputation was as formidable as his physical bulk. Sterling was the head of Pinnacle Pictures, the only studio with enough capital and enough bad blood to rival Aaron Hughes' empire. Sterling and Hughes had been at war for a decade, a feud fueled by stolen scripts and poached talent. Sterling nursed a tumbler of bourbon, eyeing Jonathan with a mixture of skepticism and pity. I saw the interview, John, Sterling rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding together. Touching stuff. Finding yourself. Very eat, pray, love. So why are you wasting my time? You just told the world you're retired. I lied, Jonathan said. The two words cut through the ambient noise of the club like a razor blade. He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a bound script. It didn't have the usual industry cover. It was black, with the title embossed in simple white letters, The Producer's Game. He slid it across the polished oak table. It stopped inches from Sterling's drink. I'm not retired, David. I'm motivated. And I'm not writing a memoir. I'm making a movie. But I can't make it with a studio that fears Aaron Hughes. I need a studio that wants to bury him. Sterling raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued not by the script, but by the cold venom in Jonathan's tone. He picked up the script, feeling its weight. A revenge flick? A little on the nose, isn't it? Director gets mad at producer who stole his wife. It's a bit cliché, John. It's not a revenge flick, Jonathan corrected, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto Sterling's. It's a procedural thriller about a producer who uses a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Blue Horizon to launder money through inflated production budgets, framing his directors for tax fraud so he can blackmail them into silence. Sterling froze. The glass of bourbon stopped halfway to his mouth. The air in the booth suddenly felt very thin. Blue Horizon was not a fictional name. It was a rumor, a whisper in the deepest financial circles, a ghost ship that no one had ever been able to pin on Aaron Hughes. Jonathan had just dropped it on the table like a grenade. That is specific, Sterling said carefully, setting his drink down. The script contains dates, Jonathan continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It contains routing numbers disguised as dialogue. It contains the exact structure of the scheme. I have written a crime scene, David, and I want to film it and project it onto a 50-foot screen for the world to see. I want Aaron to sit in the premiere and watch his own felony play out in Dolby surround sound. Sterling opened the script. He read the first page, then the second. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the dialogue. It was sharp, cruel, and terrifyingly realistic. It wasn't just a movie, it was an indictment. He looked up at Jonathan, and the pity was gone, replaced by a dawning respect and a flicker of fear. He realized he wasn't sitting across from a broken man. He was sitting across from a suicide bomber who had decided to walk out of the explosion alive. If we make this, Sterling said, his business mind calculating the risk versus the reward, Aaron will come for us. He will sue. He will try to bury the production. Let him try, Jonathan replied, a cold smile touching his lips. That's part of the marketing. The more he fights it, the more he proves it's true. We leak rumors that the film is based on actual events. We create a buzz that he can't kill. And by the time he realizes the movie itself is the evidence, it will be too late. Sterling ran a hand over his face, a slow grin spreading across his features. It was the look of a general who had just been handed the plans to the enemy's fortress. He hated Aaron Hughes more than he loved money. And this was a weapon of mass destruction. You're a son of a bitch, Miller, Sterling chuckled darkly. I thought you were soft. I thought Grace was the one with the spine. Grace is the hostage, Jonathan said, the temperature in his voice dropping to absolute zero. This is the rescue mission. Do we have a deal? Sterling extended a heavy hand. We have a deal. But John, if this goes south, I'll claim it was all fiction. I won't go down with you. If this goes south, Jonathan said, shaking the hand firmly, I won't be around to care. Jonathan walked out of the club into the cool night air of West Hollywood. The valet brought his car around, but for a moment, Jonathan just stood there, looking up at the sky. He felt a strange, vibrating connection to the city now. Somewhere out there, in the fortress of Malibu, Grace was suffering, playing her part in this twisted tragedy. She thought she was protecting him by staying silent. She didn't know that he was coming for her, not with a plea for forgiveness, but with a Trojan horse made of celluloid and light. He got into his car, the engine roaring to life. The script was sold. The game was afoot. And for the first time in months, Jonathan Miller didn't drive home to a bottle of vodka. He drove to his casting director's house. He had a villain to cast, and he needed someone who looked exactly like the man who had stolen his life. The soundstage at Pinnacle Pictures was sealed tighter than a tomb, the air heavy with the scent of sawdust, hot lights, and secrecy. For 6 weeks, Jonathan Miller had been directing the producer's game with the intensity of a man possessed, driving his cast and crew to the brink of exhaustion. This was not the glitzy, champagne-fueled production environment of his past. This was a bunker. The set was a claustrophobic recreation of an executive office, strikingly similar to Aaron Hughes's penthouse, down to the placement of the abstract art on the walls. Jonathan stood behind the monitor, his eyes dark and sunken, watching the lead actor, a man chosen specifically for his uncanny resemblance to Aaron, deliver a monologue that was less fiction and more a transcription of a crime. "Cut," Jonathan said, his voice quiet but slicing through the silence like a whip. He walked onto the set, stepping into the pool of harsh light. He approached the actor, who was wiping sweat from his brow. "You are too charming, Mark. You are playing him like a villain who knows he is a villain. That is wrong. He does not think he is the bad guy. He thinks he is the god of this world. He believes the people he steals from should be grateful he even noticed them. When you say the line about the offshore accounts, say it like you are ordering a sandwich. It means nothing to you. It is just paperwork." Mark nodded, unsettled by the director's eerie precision. Jonathan returned to the monitor. He wasn't just directing a performance. He was exorcising a demon. Every scene was a calculated strike. Every line of dialogue a coordinate on a map leading straight to the truth he had found in those stolen ledgers. He was leaking the script in fragments, a slow drip of poison into the Hollywood water supply, designed to reach one specific pair of eyes. Across town, in the sterile, glass-walled prison of the Malibu estate, the poison had begun to circulate. Aaron Hughes was not a man easily rattled, but the rumors surrounding Jonathan's secret project were becoming a nuisance. The industry blogs were buzzing with whispers that Miller's new film was explosive and based on true events. Aaron sat at his expansive desk, a tumbler of scotch in his hand, scrolling through an iPad. He had obtained a leaked PDF of the first 20 pages of the script through a contact at the casting agency. He read it with a sneer of contempt, expecting the pathetic whining of a heartbroken husband. But as he read, the sneer vanished, replaced by a rigid, cold mask of confusion. The protagonist wasn't a hero. He was a naive director named Julian, who gets framed for tax fraud. The antagonist was a producer named Adrian. The names were thin veils, but it was the details that made the hair on Aaron's arms stand up. On page 15, the character of Adrian mentions a shell company called Cerulean Sky. It was a synonym for Blue Horizon, the very real, very illegal entity Aaron used to wash his money. Aaron slammed the iPad down onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent house. "Coincidence," he muttered, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It had to be. Jonathan was an artist, a dreamer. He didn't know how to read a balance sheet. There was no way he could know about the Cayman accounts. Grace must have said something. But no, Grace was terrified. She knew the consequences. He stood up and stormed out of the office, finding Grace in the living room. She was staring out at the ocean, a statue of melancholic beauty. She looked up as he entered, her face a mask of carefully constructed indifference. "Your ex-husband," Aaron spat, tossing the iPad onto the sofa beside her, "is writing a fairy tale. He thinks he can scare me with ghost stories." Grace looked at the device, her pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" "Read it," Aaron commanded, pouring himself another drink, his hands shaking slightly. "He's writing a thriller. He's guessing at things he doesn't understand. It's pathetic, but it's annoying. I want you to read it and tell me where he's getting this inspiration. Did you talk to him, Grace? Did you send him a message?" "I haven't spoken to him since the day I left," Grace said, her voice steady, though her insides were coiling with dread. She picked up the iPad. She began to read. At first, it just seemed like a dark satire of their life. But then, she reached page 18. The scene described the director finding a hidden safe in a provincial French writing bureau. Grace stopped breathing. That was her desk. The desk she had left behind. And then, she read the dialogue spoken by the director character, Julian, as he looks at the evidence. She didn't leave because she stopped loving me. She left to be the shield. She thinks she is the villain, but she is just the ghost in the machine. And I am coming to break the machine. The world around Grace seemed to dissolve. The text swam before her eyes. Ghost in the machine. That was the phrase she had written in her diary. The diary she had locked in the safe. The diary she thought was lost forever. Jonathan knew. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, a rush of heat that thawed the ice in her veins instantly. He wasn't drinking himself to death. He wasn't hating her. He had found the diary. He understood the sacrifice. And this movie wasn't a memoir. It was a message. It was a promise. He was telling her, right under Aaron's nose, that he knew the truth and that he was fighting back. She looked up at Aaron, who was watching her with hawk-like intensity, waiting for a sign of betrayal. Grace summoned every ounce of acting ability she had absorbed from years of living with the director. She forced a scoff, a sound of dismissive amusement. "He is delusional," Grace said, tossing the iPad back onto the table with a bored flick of her wrist. "He is recycling old arguments we had about money. Cerulean sky? It sounds like a cheap perfume. He is trying to get a reaction out of you, Aaron. If you get angry, he wins. It is just fiction." Aaron studied her face, searching for a crack in the armor. Seeing none, his shoulders relaxed slightly. The arrogance returned, smoothing out the lines of worry on his forehead. "You are right. He is baiting me. He wants a lawsuit so he can get press. I won't give it to him. Let him make his little movie. No one watches indie thrillers anyway." He laughed, a hollow, victorious sound, and walked back toward his office, satisfied that his kingdom was secure. But Grace remained on the sofa, her hands trembling in her lap where he couldn't see them. She looked back at the iPad, the screen now dark, reflecting her own face. For the first time in months, the eyes staring back at her were not dead. They were alive with terror, yes, but also with a fierce, burning hope. Jonathan was coming for her. He had turned the camera around. He was directing the narrative now. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Grace realized that the ending of this story had not yet been written. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer to the man who was rewriting their fate from a soundstage in Hollywood. "Make it count, Jonathan. Make it a masterpiece." The night of the premiere arrived not with the festive anticipation of a celebration, but with the heavy, electric charge of an approaching storm. The air outside the Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard was thick with the frenetic energy of flashbulbs and the roar of the crowd, a chaotic sea of screaming fans and cynical paparazzi pinned behind velvet ropes. For Jonathan Miller, standing at the top of the red carpet, the noise was merely background static. He wore a tuxedo that fit him with the precision of armor, his face shaved clean, his eyes clear and unyielding. He looked nothing like the broken man the tabloids had feasted upon months ago. He looked like a man who had already won the war and was simply waiting for the enemy to realize they were dead. A hush rippled through the press line, followed immediately by a fresh explosion of camera shutters, signaling the arrival of the night's most controversial guests. A black limousine pulled up to the curb, and out stepped Aaron Hughes, radiating the supreme confidence of a monarch visiting his subjects. On his arm was Grace. She wore a dress of shimmering obsidian, a dark mirror to the night, her face composed into a mask of porcelain perfection. To the world, she was the trophy wife, the woman who had traded up. But as she walked up the carpet, her eyes met Jonathan's for a fleeting second. In that glance, unseen by the cameras, a message was passed, a silent acknowledgement of the trap that was about to spring. Aaron approached Jonathan, a predatory smile stretching his lips. He extended a hand, knowing the cameras were watching, daring Jonathan to cause a scene. "Congratulations on the completion, Jonathan," Aaron said, his voice loud enough for the reporters to hear. "It is always good to see indie projects find their way to the big screen. I hope it was therapeutic for you." Jonathan took the hand, his grip firm and cold. "It was enlightening, Aaron," Jonathan replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "I think you will find the attention to detail quite immersive. Enjoy the show." Inside the theater, the darkness was absolute, a cavernous belly filled with the elite of the film industry. Aaron and Grace were seated in the center row, the prime spot. Jonathan did not sit. He stood at the back of the auditorium, leaning against the wall near the projection booth, watching the back of Aaron's head. The lights dimmed, the murmurs died down, and the screen flickered to life. The producer's game began not with an opening credit sequence, but with silence. The first shot was a close-up of a desk, a meticulous recreation of Aaron's own desk in his penthouse office. The audience watched as a hand opened a ledger. The sound design was amplified, the scratch of the pen on paper sounding like a knife scraping against bone. As the film progressed, the atmosphere in the theater shifted from polite interest to uncomfortable tension. The dialogue was sharp, cruel, and familiar. The character of the producer, Adrian, spoke with Aaron's cadence, used Aaron's idioms, and even wore ties that Aaron was known to favor. It was a caricature, yes, but it was a dissection. Aaron shifted in his seat, leaning over to whisper to Grace. "He is petty. This is just a compilation of my bad habits. It is boring." But then, the third act began, and the narrative pivot occurred. The on-screen director character broke into the producer's office. He did not find a love letter. He found a safe. The camera zoomed in on the documents inside. The theater went deathly silent. On the massive IMAX screen, documents were displayed with high-definition clarity. They were not generic movie props. They were exact replicas of the invoices Jonathan had found in Grace's safe. The names of the shell companies, Blue Horizon, Apex Capital, Cerulean Sky, were plastered across the screen. The routing numbers were visible. The dates of the wire transfers matched real dates of real productions that everyone in the audience remembered working on. Aaron froze. The blood drained from his face so quickly it left him looking gray in the reflected light of the screen. This was not fiction. This was evidence. Jonathan had not just written a story. He had projected the contents of the stolen ledgers onto a 50-foot canvas. Every executive in the room, every rival producer, every journalist, was staring at the blueprint of a massive financial crime. The art was a confession, but it was Aaron's confession, forced out of him by the narrative. On screen, the protagonist spoke directly to the camera, breaking the fourth wall. "He thinks he owns the silence," the actor said, his eyes burning with Jonathan's intensity. "But silence is just a space waiting to be filled with the truth. The numbers do not lie. The money did not disappear. It was stolen." Aaron tried to stand up. Panic, cold and primal, clawed at his throat. He needed to get out. He needed to call his lawyers. He needed to stop the projection. But as he pushed himself up, he felt a hand on his arm. It was not Grace. It was the man sitting on his other side, David Sterling, the rival studio head who had distributed the film. Sterling looked up at Aaron, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Sit down, Aaron," Sterling whispered, his voice heavy with satisfaction. "We are not at the credits yet." Aaron looked around. The exits were blocked, not by locks, but by men in dark suits who had quietly entered the theater during the screening. They stood with their hands clasped in front of them, their earpieces catching the flicker of the screen. Federal agents. They were not watching the movie, they were watching him. Grace sat beside him, perfectly still, tears streaming silently down her face. She did not look at Aaron. She looked at the screen, where the fictional version of herself was finally walking out of the producer's glass house, stepping into the sunlight. She realized that Jonathan had rewritten her ending. He had not killed her off. He had set her free. The movie ended with a stark black screen and a single line of text in white, dedicated to the one who stayed to keep me clean. The lights came up. There was no applause. The silence was heavier than the darkness had been. It was the silence of a courtroom after a verdict has been read. Every head in the theater turned toward the center row. Aaron Hughes stood there, stripped of his arrogance, stripped of his power, a small man in a bespoke suit who had been outmaneuvered by the artist he thought he owned. Two of the agents walked down the aisle, their footsteps echoing on the plush carpet. They stopped at Aaron's row. One of them pulled out a badge. "Aaron Hughes," the agent said, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustic perfection of the theater. "We have a warrant for your arrest regarding federal tax evasion, money laundering, and fraud. Please come with us." The flashbulbs outside had been chaotic, but the scene inside was a masterpiece of order. Aaron looked at Grace, waiting for her to defend him, to claim it was all a mistake. Grace finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry now. She looked at him with the cold, detached curiosity of a writer observing a character she had written out of the script. "It is a wrap, Aaron," she said softly. As the agents led Aaron away in handcuffs, the paralyzed audience finally erupted. It started as a murmur, then a gasp, and then, slowly, applause began. But they were not clapping for the movie. They were clapping for the execution. Jonathan Miller remained at the back of the room, unmoving. He watched as his wife sat alone in the sea of people, the empty seat beside her a gaping wound that was finally beginning to close. He did not rush to her. The script was finished, but the reality was just beginning, and he knew that the walk down the aisle to reach her would be the longest journey of his life. The chaos of the arrest had finally subsided, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the uproar. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers had faded into the distance, carrying Aaron Hughes away from the empire he had built on pillars of sand and deceit. The crowd outside the Chinese theater had dispersed, leaving only the scattered debris of popcorn boxes and discarded flyers, the detritus of a spectacle consumed and forgotten. Jonathan Miller stood by the service exit of the theater, leaning against the cold brick wall, a cigarette unlit in his hand. He did not smoke, but the ritual of holding it gave his trembling fingers something to do. The adrenaline that had fueled him for months, the rage, the focus, the sheer, blinding need for retribution, was draining out of him, leaving him hollowed out and strangely light, like a kite whose string had been cut. The heavy metal door groaned open, and Grace stepped out into the alleyway. She looked stripped of her armor. The obsidian dress, which had seemed so formidable on the red carpet, now hung on her frame, and her posture was slumped, the defiant actress replaced by a woman exhausted by the performance of her life. She did not look surprised to see him. She stopped a few feet away, the distance between them charged with a year of unsaid words and misunderstood silences. They were two survivors of a shipwreck standing on the same shore, unsure if they were friends or strangers. "You didn't stay for the after-party," Grace said softly, her voice raspy, as if she had been screaming on the inside for hours. "There is nothing to celebrate," Jonathan replied, finally dropping the unlit cigarette onto the wet pavement. "The movie is over. The credits are rolling. Now we just have to sweep up the mess." He gestured toward his car, parked in the shadows away from the prying eyes of the lingering paparazzi. It wasn't the flashy Porsche he used to drive to impress studio heads. It was an older sedan, nondescript and reliable. "I can drive you. Not to the house. Anywhere you want to go." Grace hesitated for a moment, looking at the man she had sacrificed everything to save. She searched his face for the arrogance that used to define him, the narcissism that had made him blind to her pain for so long. But she found only a quiet, bruised, weary kindness. She nodded and got into the passenger seat. They drove in silence, winding their way up the hills, away from the suffocating grid of Hollywood. Jonathan did not drive to their glass fortress in the hills, nor did he head toward the beach. He drove to the Griffith Observatory, parking in the deserted lot that overlooked the sprawling, glittering nervous system of Los Angeles. Below them, the city pulsed with millions of lights, indifferent to their personal tragedy. It was a view they had looked at 1,000 times when they were young and hungry, back when success was just a dream and not a golden cage. Jonathan killed the engine. The silence inside the car was thick, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of a library, full of stories waiting to be read. "I read the diary, Grace," Jonathan said, staring out at the windshield, unable to look at her yet. "I know why you did it. I know you weren't running to him. You were running in front of the bullet meant for me." Grace looked down at her hands, twisting the large diamond ring Aaron had forced her to wear, a ring that felt like a shackle. She slowly pulled it off, the metal resisting for a moment before sliding free. She placed it on the dashboard. I thought if I made you hate me, you would be safe. Hate is a powerful fuel, Jonathan. It keeps you warm. Grief just makes you freeze. I couldn't let you freeze in a prison cell. I did hate you, Jonathan admitted, his voice cracking. For a while. But then I realized that the hate was just love with nowhere to go. And then I found the ledgers. And I realized that for 10 years, I was the one who was blind. I was the director who didn't know what was happening on his own set. He turned to face her then, his eyes dark with regret. I am sorry, Grace. Not just for the last year. I am sorry for the years before that. I am sorry that I let you become a ghost in my machine. I took your words, your edits, your soul, and I put my name on them. I made you invisible long before you ran away. Grace looked up, tears finally spilling over, hot and cleansing. This was the apology she had never asked for, but always needed. It wasn't about the affair or the scandal. It was about the erasure. I didn't mind being the ghost, John. I just didn't want to be the victim. I wanted to be your partner. But somewhere along the way, we stopped writing the same story. Then we start a new draft, Jonathan said firmly. No more ghostwriters. No more shadows. If you ever write again, it will be under your name. If you ever love again, it will be on your terms. Even if it's not with me. The admission hung in the air, brave and terrifying. He was letting her go. He had destroyed her captor, but he was refusing to become her jailer. He was giving her the one thing Aaron never could, absolute autonomy. Grace looked at the city lights, blurring through her tears. She felt the weight of the last decade lifting, dissolved by the truth. She looked at Jonathan, not the genius director, but the flawed, broken, brilliant man who had torn down the sky to save her. She realized that the love remaining between them was not the fiery, naive romance of their youth. It was something grayer, quieter, and infinitely more durable. It was the love of two people who had seen the worst of each other and were still sitting in the same car. I don't have anywhere to go, Grace whispered. The apartment Aaron rented is a crime scene. The house we shared is. It feels like a museum of a dead marriage. I sold the house, Jonathan said quietly. Last week. I bought a small place in Silver Lake. It has a garden. It has a messy office. It has no awards on the shelves. It's just a house. Grace smiled, a small, fragile thing that felt like the first sunrise after a long winter. Silver Lake sounds nice. It sounds real. It is, Jonathan said. He reached across the console, not to grab her hand, but to offer his palm, open and waiting. It was an invitation, not a command. We can just drive there. We can have coffee. We can sleep in separate rooms. We can just be two people who survived a horror movie. And we can see what happens in the sequel. Grace looked at his hand. She thought about the pain, the betrayal, the years of silence. And then she thought about the script he had written for her, the way he had turned her shame into heroism on the biggest screen in the world. He had seen her. He had really seen her. She reached out and placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, but his grip was warm. Take me home, Jonathan, she said. He started the car. They didn't drive off into a sunset. They drove into the gray, misty reality of the Los Angeles night. There was no crescendo of music, no dramatic kiss. There was just the hum of the engine and the road stretching out before them, unwritten and waiting. They were bruised, they were scarred, and they were tired. But as they merged onto the freeway, moving together through the sea of red taillights, they were no longer acting. For the first time in their lives, they were just living. And that, Jonathan thought as he glanced at the woman breathing softly beside him, was the only ending that really mattered. And that is how Jonathan Miller turned his greatest tragedy into his absolute masterpiece. This story reminds us that true love isn't always about grand romantic gestures or perfect happiness. Sometimes, it is about the quiet, painful sacrifices we make to protect the ones we hold dear. Grace walked into the darkness so Jonathan could stay in the light, and Jonathan tore down the sky to bring her back home. They didn't get a fairy tale, but they got something real, a second chance. If this story touched your heart or gave you chills, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more of these deep, emotional stories to you. Now, I have a tough question for you. If you were in Jonathan's shoes, could you have forgiven Grace for keeping such a massive secret, or would the trust be gone forever? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. Also, I love connecting with you guys. Tell me, what city or country are you watching from today? Shout out your hometown. Check out the next video on the screen for another incredible drama.